Ms. Johnson was not the kind of person who drew attention when she entered a room. She worked quietly, moving from one hallway to another with her cleaning cart, making sure everything in the school stayed neat and tidy. Students often walked past her without a second glance, too busy with their own lives to notice the woman who swept their classrooms, polished the floors, and emptied the trash cans every day. To them, she was just the custodian. But behind her gentle smile and quiet nature, there was so much more to her story. Every morning, long before the first bell rang, Ms. Johnson arrived at the school. She wore her neatly pressed uniform and comfortable shoes, ready for another day of hard work. She always greeted the security guard with a warm, "Good morning," and sometimes brought fresh coffee in an old thermos. Even though her job was demanding, she never complained. She believed in giving her best, no matter what task she had in front of her. Students who came in early would sometimes see her humming softly while dusting the blackboards or arranging the chairs. Her hum carried a tune, gentle but beautiful, as if she carried music in her heart. But nobody paid much attention. To most of the teachers and students, she was invisible, just another worker in the background. Still, she didn't mind. She had grown used to being overlooked, and she had learned to find joy in small things, like a sunny morning, a child's laughter echoing down the hallway, or the sound of the piano in the music room when someone practiced after class. What nobody knew was that Ms. Johnson had once dreamed of a life filled with music. As a little girl, she had discovered her love for the piano in church. Her small hands had barely reached the keys, but her determination had made up for it. By the time she was a teenager, she could play hymns and even compose little melodies of her own. She had imagined herself one day performing on stage, wearing a beautiful gown, the spotlight shining on her as audiences clapped for her talent. But life had other plans. Her family was poor and they could not afford music school. She took whatever work she could find to help her parents. Dreams slowly gave way to responsibilities. She never complained, but she carried that quiet ache with her, the ache of knowing she had a gift that the world might never see. Over the years, she kept playing whenever she had the chance, sometimes at church, sometimes on an old keyboard a neighbor had given her. Music was still a part of her soul, even if it was hidden away from the eyes of others. At school, the piano in the corner of the classroom often caught her attention when she passed by. Sometimes when no one was around, she would pause for just a second, staring at the keys. Her fingers would twitch slightly, as if they longed to touch them, but she always moved on quickly. The students would laugh if they saw her playing, she thought. The teachers would probably frown. She told herself it was better to stay in the background, better to remain the quiet custodian who blended into the walls. Yet the students noticed little things, even if they didn't talk about them. They noticed that she always had kind eyes and that she spoke politely to everyone. When a student dropped their books, she rushed to help. When someone looked upset, she offered a gentle smile. Though she was often ignored, there was a calm strength in the way she carried herself. She was more than just a custodian. She was like a guardian of the school's spirit, making sure it was always a place where learning could happen. Still, teenagers can be careless. Some whispered jokes about her uniform. Some teased about how she hummed to herself. Ms. Johnson never answered back. She believed that kindness was more powerful than anger, and deep inside she knew something the students didn't. Every person carries a hidden story, a hidden gift. Hers was just waiting for the right moment to be revealed. What nobody expected was how soon that moment would come. For now, though, Ms. Johnson continued her days quietly. She pushed her cart through the corridors, polished the glass windows until they shined, and hummed little melodies from her childhood. The music was always there, living inside her heart even when no one listened. To the world, she was just the black custodian of Lincoln High School. But to herself, she was still the little girl who once dreamed of filling the world with music. She carried that dream like a secret flame, hidden but never extinguished, waiting for the day when fate would give her the chance to let it shine. That afternoon, the classroom was buzzing with restless energy. The students had just returned from lunch, laughing and chatting while the teacher stood at the front trying to regain control. The air felt heavy with impatience. Nobody was in the mood for another boring lesson. To break the tension and perhaps gain some attention, the teacher's eyes wandered toward the doorway, where Ms. Johnson happened to be passing by with her cart. The teacher smirked. "Hey, Ms. Johnson," he called out loudly, loud enough for the entire class to hear. She paused, startled that she was being addressed in the middle of class. "Why don't you come in here for a minute? We could use some entertainment." Some students snickered immediately, already sensing where this was going. Ms. Johnson hesitated. She rarely stepped inside classrooms unless it was to clean after hours. Her eyes shifted from the teacher to the rows of curious faces staring at her. She gave a polite smile, the kind she used whenever someone tried to make her uncomfortable, and slowly stepped inside. The teacher gestured toward the upright piano in the corner. The instrument had been sitting there untouched for weeks. "Why don't you play us something?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I'm sure someone like you must know a few simple tunes." Laughter rippled through the class. Some students leaned forward eagerly, expecting a clumsy show. A few whispered jokes, thinking it would be funny to watch the custodian fumble with the keys. To them, it was just harmless fun. But to Ms. Johnson, the request felt like a spotlight shining too brightly. Not to celebrate her, but to expose her. She froze for a moment. Memories rushed back. Those church days, her youthful dreams, the long years of being overlooked. She hadn't played for anyone in a long time. Not since her life had become a cycle of work and responsibility. She wasn't afraid of the piano. She was afraid of the laughter, the judgment, the possibility that if she revealed this piece of herself, it might be mocked instead of cherished. Her hands tightened around the handle of her cart. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said softly, her voice almost drowned by the chuckles around her. But the teacher pushed further. "Come on, don't be shy. Just a little performance. Show us what you've got." The class echoed him with teasing encouragement. "Yeah, play something. Don't be scared." "We want to hear it." Their voices weren't full of genuine excitement. They carried the sharpness of mockery, the kind of laughter that cuts before a single note is even played. Ms. Johnson felt her cheeks grow warm. Part of her wanted to shake her head and walk away, to remind them she was there to clean, not to entertain. But another part of her stirred. The part that had been silent for too long, the part that still believed in her gift. Slowly, she let go of the cart and walked toward the piano. Each step echoed against the floor, and the classroom grew quieter. The students, sensing something was about to happen, leaned back in their chairs. Even the ones who had laughed the loudest began to hold their breath, curious to see if she would actually go through with it. Ms. Johnson sat down on the worn piano bench. The wood creaked under her weight, and she gently placed her hands on her lap. Her eyes scanned the keys, and for a moment, she was transported back to her childhood, the smell of church pews, the sound of her mother's voice telling her she had a gift, the evenings when she practiced until her fingers ached, her heart pounded. The teacher folded his arms, a mocking smile still tugging at his lips. The students whispered, waiting for her to make a fool of herself. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let her fingers hover just above the ivory keys. That was the moment, the turning point. She had a choice: walk away in silence and let them laugh, or trust herself and let the music inside her speak. The room was silent now, more silent than it had been all day. And as her hand slowly lowered toward the keys, the laughter died completely. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the sound that would come next. The room was silent, so silent that even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Every eye was fixed on Ms. Johnson as her fingers hovered above the piano keys. For a moment she didn't play. She just sat there, breathing slowly, as though gathering strength not just for a performance, but for something far greater, something that might finally reveal a hidden piece of herself to the world. The students leaned forward, their earlier laughter fading into curiosity. A few of them exchanged glances, whispering, "Is she really going to play?" The teacher, arms folded smugly across his chest, still wore the faintest hint of a mocking smile, confident that the custodian would stumble and confirm his cruel little joke. Then, gently, her fingers touched the keys. The first notes floated into the air, soft and uncertain, almost like a whisper. The sound was fragile, but it carried a kind of beauty that immediately hushed the room. It wasn't the clumsy noise the students had expected. It was delicate, like the opening lines of a story written in music. Ms. Johnson closed her eyes. The classroom around her faded away, and she wasn't sitting on a worn bench anymore. In her mind, she was back in that little church from her childhood, her mother's proud face watching her play, the congregation swaying to the melodies she created. Her body relaxed and the hesitation disappeared. Her fingers began to move with purpose. The soft notes grew stronger, weaving into a melody so rich that it seemed to fill every corner of the classroom. The students who had been ready to laugh were now leaning back in awe, their mouths slightly open. Some of them had goosebumps rising on their arms. The piano, which had gathered dust for weeks, now sang under her touch. Each chord rang with emotion, joy, sorrow, resilience, all wrapped into music that spoke louder than words ever could. She played with skill, yes, but also with a depth of feeling that no music lesson could teach. This was the kind of music that came from living a life full of struggles and dreams left unfulfilled, yet never forgotten. Her left hand rolled across the bass's keys, grounding the music with strength, while her right hand danced lightly over the higher notes like a bird taking flight. The melody swelled, rising and falling, capturing the rhythm of a heart that had known both pain and hope. The students felt it too. Their earlier giggles were replaced by silence so deep it felt sacred. The teacher, still standing at the front, lost the smugness in his expression. His eyebrows furrowed as he listened, the mocking smile wiped clean from his face. He hadn't expected this. No one had. His little joke had turned into something else entirely. Something powerful, undeniable. One girl in the front row felt tears sting her eyes. She had never thought about Ms. Johnson as anything more than the lady who cleaned the floors. Yet here she was, revealing a side of herself that was extraordinary, a side that demanded respect. Another boy leaned back slowly in his chair, his arms crossed not because he was mocking, but because he was trying to hide how shaken he felt. The music grew even more intense. Ms. Johnson's body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her face calm but full of expression. She was lost in the music now, no longer thinking of who was watching. The piano had always been her safe place, her language, her prayer. And now, for the first time in years, she was letting the world hear her heart. Minutes passed, though it felt like only seconds. The song shifted from soft and sorrowful to strong and triumphant, as if telling the story of her life, the hardships, the sacrifices, the dreams buried under years of silence, and the strength that had carried her through it all. By the time she struck the final chord, the classroom was transformed. The sound hung in the air for a moment, echoing like a final breath before fading into silence. She slowly lifted her hands off the keys and rested them in her lap. For a second, she didn't move. She didn't even open her eyes. She just sat there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as though she had just poured her soul out onto the keys. The students didn't laugh. They didn't clap right away either. They were too stunned, too moved, still caught in the spell of what they had just witnessed. Then slowly, one pair of hands began to clap. Another joined. And then the whole classroom erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite clapping reserved for a school performance. It was raw, loud, and filled with genuine admiration. Some students even stood, unable to contain their amazement. A few were wiping their eyes, embarrassed to be caught crying over a piano piece. The teacher, red-faced, shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his attempt to belittle her had backfired spectacularly. Ms. Johnson finally opened her eyes. She didn't smile, at least not right away. She just looked at the students who were now cheering for her, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. For once, they weren't looking at her as the custodian. They were looking at her as something else entirely, an artist, a musician, a woman of extraordinary talent. In that moment, the classroom was no longer a place of mockery. It had become a stage, and Ms. Johnson, the woman who had spent years being invisible, had claimed her rightful place at its center. When the final note of the melody dissolved into silence, the classroom seemed suspended in time. For a moment, nobody moved. It was as though the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. The buzzing laughter that had filled the space just minutes earlier had been erased, replaced with a heavy, almost sacred quiet. The students sat frozen, their faces blank with shock. Some stared at Ms. Johnson as though they were seeing her for the first time. Others looked down at their desks, ashamed of the smirks they had worn when she first walked in. The music still lingered in their minds, echoing louder than the teasing words they had thrown at her. A boy in the back, usually the loudest voice in the class, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his mouth slightly open. He had expected a clumsy, awkward mess that would give him another joke to share later. Instead, he had witnessed something he couldn't laugh at. It made him uncomfortable, but in a way that felt like a lesson pressing down on him. The girl in the front row, the one who had felt her eyes water during the performance, wiped her cheeks quickly, hoping no one noticed her tears. She wasn't the only one. Several students shifted in their seats, embarrassed by the emotions stirring inside them. They had been caught off guard. Music had broken through the walls of their youthful arrogance and touched something deeper than they were used to showing. Even the students who didn't care much for music could feel the power of what had happened. It wasn't about scales or chords or technique. It was about the way Ms. Johnson played, pouring her story into each note. They felt her struggles, her strength, her years of silence turning into sound. They didn't need to know her past to understand that the melody had been born out of real life, out of pain and resilience. All eyes eventually drifted toward the teacher. He was still standing at the front of the room, arms crossed loosely, but the arrogance that had colored his face earlier was gone. His lips were pressed tightly together, his brow furrowed, his jaw stiff. He had expected the performance to be nothing more than a passing distraction, a way to get the students laughing and keep the class under control. Instead, he had been the unwilling witness to a moment that made his actions look cruel and small. For the first time that day, the teacher avoided meeting the students' eyes. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at the floor as if he could escape the reality of what had just unfolded. He didn't clap. He couldn't. The sound of applause would have been an admission that he had been wrong, that the custodian he had mocked held a gift greater than anything he could have imagined. But the students didn't wait for him. Slowly, as though waking from a trance, one girl brought her hands together in a quiet clap. It echoed through the stillness, gentle but steady. Another student followed, then another, until the entire classroom erupted into applause. Chairs scraped against the floor as some students stood, clapping loudly, cheering, even whistling in admiration. The sound washed over Ms. Johnson. She blinked, her calm expression unchanging, but inside, her heart swelled with emotion. She hadn't played for applause. She hadn't even intended to play at all. But here she was, receiving the kind of recognition she had long ago convinced herself she would never have. The applause wasn't just appreciation, it was respect. Real, genuine respect from the same students who had moments earlier seen her as nothing more than the woman who pushed a cart and swept their floors. Now they looked at her with awe, as though the piano had revealed a truth none of them had expected, that greatness could come from the most unexpected places. One boy near the middle of the room whispered to his friend, "She's amazing." His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and admiration. His friend didn't even answer. He just nodded slowly, still clapping, still trying to process what he had just seen. The teacher finally lifted his eyes, watching the scene unfold. The clapping grew louder, rolling through the room like a wave. He couldn't stop it, couldn't cover it with a joke or dismiss it with a smirk. His authority in that moment felt small, overshadowed by the presence of the custodian who had unknowingly turned the classroom into a stage. Ms. Johnson bowed her head slightly, not in performance but in quiet gratitude. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. Her life had been about service, about staying in the background, about making sure others had what they needed. To be in the center, to have every pair of eyes focused on her with admiration, felt overwhelming but also deeply healing. The sound of clapping went on, until the students finally began to settle back into their seats. The room was still buzzing with energy, but it was no longer the restless noise of boredom. It was the sound of hearts awakened, of minds opened, of a collective realization that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Even as the applause faded, the atmosphere remained charged. The students whispered to one another, not with jokes but with genuine wonder. They replayed the melody in their minds, trying to remember how it had made them feel. Some would later say it was the most beautiful thing they had ever heard in that school. The teacher cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the class, but his voice sounded smaller than before. The authority he usually carried so easily now felt fragile, overshadowed by the woman who had just redefined herself in front of them all. Ms. Johnson quietly stood from the bench. She didn't say a word. She simply gave the students a soft smile, picked up her cart, and walked toward the door. The students watched her leave in silence, their eyes following her until she disappeared into the hallway. Long after she was gone, the classroom still felt different. The students sat quietly, each lost in their thoughts, each carrying the weight of what they had just experienced. The mocking laughter that had started it all seemed distant now, almost shameful. What lingered instead was the echo of the music and the lesson it carried. That everyone has a story, a gift, a greatness hidden beneath the surface. And in that single afternoon, the custodian they had overlooked became unforgettable. As the sound of applause slowly faded in the classroom, Miss Johnson carried on with her cart, leaving behind a room filled with stunned silence. But though her steps carried her forward, her mind drifted backward, back to the long road that had led her here, back to the hidden chapters of her life that few, if any, knew long before she wore a custodian's uniform. She was just a little girl in a small neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, and dreams were often sacrificed for survival. Her earliest memory of the piano was in the tiny church her family attended every Sunday. The old wooden piano there had missing keys and a creaky pedal, but to her it was the most magical thing she had ever seen. She would sit in the front pew, eyes wide, watching the church pianist's fingers glide across the keys. Every note felt like a story, every chord like a prayer whispered to heaven. One afternoon when the church was empty, little Miss Johnson had dared to press her small fingers onto the keys. The sound that came out wasn't perfect, but it was enough to light a fire in her heart. From then on, every chance she got, she would sneak to that piano, teaching herself piece by piece, note by note, guided only by her ear and determination. Her mother noticed her passion. "Baby," she once said, smiling proudly, "God put something special in those hands of yours." Those words became a lifeline, especially in the years that followed when life grew harder. Her family didn't have much. Money was always tight, food was stretched thin, bills piled up, and every dream seemed weighed down by reality. When her classmates signed up for music lessons, she stayed behind, watching with longing. They had teachers and books. She had only her determination and the worn church piano. Still, she practiced whenever she could, pouring into the keys not just her love of music, but also her frustrations, her hopes, her prayers for a better life. By the time she reached her teenage years, she could play hymns so beautifully that people in the congregation would close their eyes and sway, as though transported somewhere else. Some even whispered that she had the talent to become a real pianist, someone who could play on big stages with grand pianos and spotlights. She dreamed of it too. In the quiet of her small room at night, she imagined herself in elegant gowns bowing before audiences who rose to their feet to applaud her. But reality was unforgiving. Her father fell ill, and her mother had to take on extra shifts just to keep the family afloat. Suddenly, the dream of music school seemed impossible. Ms. Johnson, still only a teenager, took on odd jobs to help, cleaning houses, babysitting, and later working in stores. Every dollar went toward her family's survival. The piano, though still in her heart, had to move to the background. There were moments when she wanted to rebel, to chase her dream no matter what. But every time she saw her mother's tired face, she knew her place was beside her family, holding them together. Sacrifice became her silent song. As the years passed, life swept her along. One responsibility turned into another, and before she knew it, her dreams of stages and concerts had faded like a distant echo. She married, had children of her own, and worked tirelessly to provide for them. Life was not unkind, but it was demanding, leaving little room for dreams. Yet the music never left her. She played whenever she found a piano, at church, at a friend's house, sometimes on a second-hand keyboard she managed to buy. She played not for audiences anymore, but for herself, as a way to keep her soul alive. Each note reminded her of who she once was, and who she still was beneath the layers of duty and responsibility. When her children grew up and life settled into a slower rhythm, Ms. Johnson found herself working at the school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, honest work. She grew to love the building, the sound of young voices in the hallways, the way the classroom seemed to hum with possibility. Still, the piano in the corner of the music room always caught her eye. She would glance at it when no one was looking, her fingers twitching slightly, aching to play. But she never dared. Custodians weren't meant to sit at instruments. They were meant to clean around them, unseen and unnoticed. Until today, until the teacher's mocking challenge had pushed her onto the bench. Until her fingers had found their way back to the keys, unlocking not just music but years of memories, years of silence, years of hidden greatness. The song she had played wasn't random. It had been a piece she composed for herself many years ago. Late at night, when she had felt her dreams slipping away, she had poured her sorrow and her hope into it, calling it My Prayer. It wasn't written on sheet music, but carved into her soul. And now, for the first time, she had shared it. Not with a church congregation, not with a paying audience, but with a room of teenagers who had mocked her seconds before. The irony didn't escape her. The very act meant to humiliate her had become the stage she had once dreamed of. Not the grand stage of her imagination, but a stage nonetheless where her talent could no longer be denied. As she walked through the school hallway pushing her cart again, her heart was lighter. She didn't know how the students would talk about her performance later, whether they would keep mocking her or whether they would tell the story with respect. But she knew one thing for certain. She had reclaimed a piece of herself. The music inside her was alive again, and no amount of years, no hardships, no uniform could take that away. When the last echo of clapping had died down and Miss Johnson quietly left the room, the atmosphere in the classroom didn't return to normal. Something had shifted, something invisible but undeniable. The room felt heavier. Not with boredom like before, but with reflection. The students sat in silence, their minds replaying the music. The way her fingers had danced across the keys, the expression on her face as she poured her soul into every note. No one dared to speak at first. It was as though they were afraid their words might shatter the fragile power of the moment. Finally, a boy in the back whispered, "I didn't know she could do that." His voice wasn't mocking. It carried amazement, maybe even a touch of regret. Another student nodded slowly. "I thought she was just, the janitor." The word hung in the air like a confession, raw and uncomfortable. For the first time, many of them realized how casually they had dismissed her all these years. She had been there every day, sweeping floors, emptying bins, wiping down chalkboards. Yet none of them had ever stopped to think about who she really was, or what stories and talents she might carry. The girl in the front row, the one who had been wiping away tears during the performance, spoke softly. She wasn't just playing. She was telling us something, like a story but without words. Several students nodded, their expressions serious, thoughtful. It was strange for them. They were used to joking, gossiping, laughing through boring lessons. But now they felt something deeper, respect and maybe a bit of shame. Some of the students began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They remembered the way they had laughed when the teacher first called her in. They remembered their mocking whispers, their snickers, the way they had expected her to fail. The guilt was heavy. For a moment they wished they could take it back, wished they could have welcomed her with open minds instead of cruel amusement. At the front of the room, the teacher still stood frozen. He had not spoken since the performance ended. His arms were no longer crossed in arrogance. They now hung limply at his sides. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. He could feel the student's eyes flickering toward him, waiting to see what he would say, how he would spin this moment. But the truth was, he had no words. He knew the performance had revealed not just Ms. Johnson's greatness, but also his own smallness. He had set her up as the punchline to a cruel joke, only to be humiliated himself by the sheer force of her talent and dignity. The more he thought about it, the more a knot of shame tightened in his chest. He tried to clear his throat, tried to regain his authority. "All right, settle down," he said at last, but his voice was weaker than usual. It lacked its usual commanding tone, and even the students could hear the tremor in it. For the first time, he sounded unsure of himself. The students obeyed, but not out of respect for him. Their respect had shifted. The authority in the room no longer belonged to the man standing at the front. It belonged to the woman who had walked out moments before. She had changed the entire energy of the room without saying a single word. One boy leaned over to his friend and whispered, "You think she used to be a real pianist or something?" His friend shrugged, wide-eyed. "Maybe. She plays better than anyone I've ever heard." Others began to wonder too. Who was Ms. Johnson really? What life had she lived before this? What other talents did she hide beneath her quiet presence? The mystery only deepened their respect. For the first time, they didn't see her as invisible. They saw her as someone extraordinary. The teacher, sensing his control slipping, turned quickly to the blackboard and began scribbling down notes for the lesson. But even he knew the students weren't paying attention. Their minds were elsewhere, still caught in the glow of what they had witnessed. The classroom, which had once been full of arrogance and youthful cruelty, now buzzed with something new: humility. Some of the students felt guilty, yes, but others felt inspired. They realized that if Ms. Johnson could carry such greatness hidden beneath a uniform and unnoticed by everyone, Maybe they too carried hidden strengths inside themselves. Maybe they had underestimated not just her but themselves. One girl, quiet and shy, sat straighter in her chair. She had always loved writing poetry but had never shared it with anyone, afraid of being laughed at. But now, watching how Ms. Johnson had silenced the room with her music, she wondered if perhaps her own gift could matter too. Another boy who often struggled with self-confidence felt a spark of hope ignite inside him. If the custodian could surprise the entire school with her hidden brilliance, maybe he had a hidden brilliance of his own, waiting to be discovered. And so, while Ms. Johnson went back to her daily routine in the hallways, sweeping and dusting, the classroom she had left behind was no longer the same. The students weren't just thinking about their math problems or their next exam. They were thinking about her strength, her talent, her quiet dignity. The teacher, too, couldn't escape the weight of the moment. All through the rest of the lesson, his thoughts wandered. Shame gnawed at him. He had thought himself clever, powerful enough to humiliate someone with less status. But instead, he had been humbled by her. Deep down, he knew he owed her an apology, yet his pride kept him silent. Still, he couldn't deny the truth. That day, in front of his entire class, Ms. Johnson had taught a lesson greater than anything he could ever write on a chalkboard. A lesson about respect, about humility, about the dangers of judging people by their job, their clothes, or their place in society. And though he would never admit it out loud, the teacher felt something else too, fear, because he knew the story of what had happened in his classroom wouldn't stay there. By the end of the day, the entire school would know. By the end of that school day, whispers had already spread beyond the four walls of the classroom. What began as stunned silence soon turned into murmurs in the hallways, then conversations at lunch tables, and by afternoon dismissal. It had become the only story students wanted to talk about. "Did you hear what happened in Mr. Clark's class?" one boy whispered to his friends as they walked toward the bus stop. The custodian played the piano. "I swear it was better than anything I've ever heard." Another student, still wide-eyed, chimed in, "No, you don't understand. She wasn't just good, she was incredible." Everyone was frozen. Even Mr. Clark didn't know what to say. By the time students got home, the story was retold dozens of times, each version slightly exaggerated but carrying the same truth. The woman they had all walked past 100 times, the woman who had mopped their floors and emptied their trash cans, had stunned an entire classroom with music so powerful that it left them speechless. The next morning, when Ms. Johnson walked into the school with her usual quiet dignity, something felt different. Students who normally rushed past her without a glance now slowed down, their eyes following her with curiosity and respect. Some even smiled at her, hesitant at first but genuine. A few offered small greetings. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," words she rarely heard from them before. She didn't understand it at first. She thought perhaps she had something on her uniform or that her cart looked unusual, but then she noticed the stares, the whispers, the way the piano in the music room seemed to draw students who peeked in, hoping she might play again. Slowly, she realized the truth. The story of what had happened in that classroom was no longer a secret. Meanwhile, the teacher who had forced her to play, Mr. Clark, carried himself differently too. He walked through the halls with a stiffness in his step, his pride wounded. Colleagues had begun asking him about the performance, curious and amused by the rumors. "I heard your custodian is a better pianist than half the music teachers in the district," one of them joked in the staff room. Mr. Clark forced a laugh, but inside, he burned with shame. For the students, however, the story had already become more than gossip. It was becoming a lesson. At lunch, groups of teenagers sat around discussing it with awe. "Imagine working here all these years and nobody knowing she had that kind of talent," one said. "It makes you wonder how many people around us have stories we don't know," another added. "I feel bad for laughing when she walked in, like she showed us all up without even trying." Heads nodded around the table. It was rare for high schoolers to admit guilt, but Ms. Johnson's performance had touched something real in them, something that made them reflect in ways they weren't used to. The music teacher, Mrs. Avery, also heard about it. Curious, she approached Ms. Johnson later that day as she was polishing the floors near the auditorium. "I heard you played yesterday," she said softly, her eyes kind. "The students can't stop talking about it." Ms. Johnson smiled politely, a little embarrassed. "I just played a little. Nothing special," but Mrs. Avery shook her head. "It wasn't nothing. I can tell by the way they described it. You moved them. That's not something many people can do. Ms. Johnson looked down, her hands tightening around the mop handle. Compliments like that felt strange to her. She wasn't used to being praised, especially not for something that had once been her secret dream. She had spent so many years hiding her music that it felt almost dangerous to let people see it now. Back in the classroom, the students' respect for her only grew. They began noticing things they had overlooked before. The way she hummed while she worked. The way her presence brought a sense of calm to the halls. The way she always carried herself with quiet grace. To them, she was no longer just the custodian. She was a musician, an artist, someone extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Mr. Clark, however, found no such comfort. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over. The mocking tone in his voice, the laughter of his students, and then the music that had silenced them all. Each time his stomach twisted tighter. He had wanted to make her look small, but instead he had exposed his own cruelty. Now the students looked at him differently too. He noticed their sideways glances, the way their respect had shifted toward Miss Johnson. That evening, as he sat in the quiet of his home, he couldn't escape the truth. He had been humbled. And deep down, though he tried to bury it, he knew he owed her more than silence. He owed her an apology. At the same time, the students began carrying the story home to their families. Parents listened, intrigued, surprised, and proud. "The custodian at your school can play like that?" they asked. "Are you sure?" And the kids would nod eagerly, their eyes shining. "She's amazing. You should have heard her." By the end of the week, Ms. Johnson had become more than just a rumor. She was a symbol. A symbol of hidden talent, of resilience, of why you should never judge someone by their uniform or their role. She didn't seek the attention. She still moved quietly through the halls, still cleaned with the same dedication she always had. But now, when she walked by, she wasn't invisible anymore. Students stepped aside respectfully. Teachers nodded at her with newfound warmth. And though she didn't always show it on her face, inside she felt something she hadn't in years. Seen. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of Ms. Johnson's performance did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger with time, like the echo of a song that refuses to leave your heart. The students still spoke about it in hushed tones, not as gossip anymore, but as a story they carried with pride. Their custodian, the woman everyone had overlooked, had stunned an entire classroom with music that felt bigger than words. The story traveled beyond the students, beyond the hallways, even beyond the school itself. Parents repeated it at dinner tables. Neighbors whispered it to one another. And soon, Ms. Johnson's name became more than a quiet footnote in the school's daily life. She had become a symbol, though she never asked to be one. For the students, the lesson lingered in their minds like a shadow that followed them. Many of them found themselves looking differently at the people around them. The cafeteria worker who handed them food, the bus driver who greeted them each morning, even the quiet classmates they rarely noticed. Suddenly, they began to wonder what hidden stories, what hidden talents might lie beneath the surface. Ms. Johnson had taught them without a single lecture that greatness often hides in plain sight. But no one felt the weight of the lesson more than Mr. Clark. Every time he saw Ms. Johnson pushing her cart past his classroom, his chest tightened. He remembered the mocking tone in his own voice, the laughter he had encouraged, the smugness on his face before she played, and then he remembered the music, the way it had silenced him, the way it had stripped him of his pride in front of his students. He wanted to apologize. The words lived in his throat, heavy and urgent, but each time he tried, his pride held him back. What would he even say? "I tried to humiliate you, but you humbled me instead?" Still, the guilt gnawed at him, and deep down, he knew that silence was its own kind of cowardice. One afternoon, he found her in the hallway, polishing the glass doors near the main office. He hesitated, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his voice stuck in his chest. She noticed him standing there and gave him the same warm, polite smile she gave everyone. That smile made the weight inside him heavier. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual confidence. She looked up at him, patient, waiting. He shifted uncomfortably. I just wanted to say I was wrong. About the other day." Her expression softened, but she didn't interrupt. "I shouldn't have asked you like that. I was trying to make a joke, but it wasn't funny. It was disrespectful. And what you did, what you played, it was extraordinary. I'm sorry. For a moment the hallway was silent. Then Ms. Johnson gave him a small nod, her eyes kind but steady. Thank you, she said simply. There was no bitterness in her tone, no trace of resentment. Just dignity. That simple response was more powerful than anything else she could have said. It humbled him further, leaving him standing there, realizing that true greatness was not only in her music but in her grace. As for the students, they never forgot that day. Some of them carried it with them into adulthood, retelling the story to their own children years later. Don't ever underestimate anyone, they would say. Once, when I was in high school, our custodian played the piano and changed the way we all saw her, and ourselves. Ms. Johnson, however, did not seek recognition. She continued her work as always, humming softly as she moved from classroom to classroom. Yet now, when she passed, students greeted her with respect. Teachers looked at her with warmth. And sometimes when the halls were quiet, a student would ask, "Ms. Johnson, will you play for us again?" On rare occasions she did. She would sit at the piano, her fingers gliding across the keys, and once again the air would fill with the kind of music that stilled hearts and opened minds. Each performance was not just a song, it was a reminder of who she was and what she represented. And so Ms. Johnson, the woman who had once been invisible, became unforgettable. Not because she demanded attention, but because her quiet strength, her hidden talent, and her grace had revealed a truth that no one in that school would ever forget. Greatness does not wear a title. It does not need a stage. Sometimes it hides in the humblest of places, waiting for the moment when the world finally stops to listen.